Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Alan Sessoms, and I am a national board member of the America-Israel Friendship League, where I've been a proud member and supporter for many years. Over the years, we at the AIFL have remained steadfast in our commitment to promoting U.S. Israel relations through shared common democratic values, which we know cannot be taken for granted. Through our leadership programs and platforms, we have introduced future leaders to both Israel and the United States. I was privileged to see this firsthand as a participant in AIFL's University President's Delegation when I was president of Queens College of the City University of New York. I experienced firsthand how AIFL uses education and promoting knowledge in various fields to foster understanding and communication. Clearly, understanding and communication can contribute to the emergence of a freer, more secure, and more prosperous world. A world that is currently a quagmire of crises and conflicts that we strive to resolve through peaceful and diplomatic means. It is a pleasure and honor for me to welcome you once again to today's program, which features a star-studded panel of diplomatic giants. The knowledge, experience, practical wisdom, and just skill embodied by each member of today's panel was garnered over many decades of skillful and often creative diplomacy, with the knowledge that negotiations within the realm of international relations are not one size fits all. It is my pleasure to introduce the panelists. First, Ambassador Zalman Shoval. Ambassador Shoval is an Israeli banker, politician, and diplomat. He served as Israeli ambassador to the United States from 1990 to 1993, and again from 1998 to 2000. He was also a member of the Knesset and of the Likud political party. Second, my dear friend and colleague, Ambassador Thomas Pickering. I am very proud of the fact that it was Tom who first brought me into the State Department. Tom has served as the U.S. ambassador to Russia, India, the United Nations, El Salvador, Nigeria, Jordan, and from 1985 to 1988 to Israel. He also served as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs in the U.S. Department of State from 1997 to 2000. Our moderator is my colleague and friend, Ambassador Dan Gilliman, who served as Israeli ambassador to the United Nations from 2003 to 2008. Dan is also chairman of AIFL Israel. There's a lot to discuss, and I look forward to this important conversation. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, for this very gracious introduction. And I must say I'm awed and honored to be joined by two gentlemen, who are both my heroes, my mentors, and my friends. Zalman Shoval is truly the elder statesman and the model diplomat of Israeli international relations and Israeli life. And Tom Pickering is still remembered and even missed by Israelis who witnessed his star performance in Israel. In fact, Tom and Alice were the golden couple of diplomacy in Israel. Tom then went on to the United Nations, to India, to Russia, which is a testament to his excellence. So truly, I'm joined by two friends, two heroes, and two mentors, and I'm looking forward to this discussion and dialogue today. I'd like to start by a fact that I admit we did not plan and did not engineer, but we are having this webinar at a very, very special moment in time. In fact, we're having it a few months after a new president and a new administration was sworn in Washington, D.C., and literally 3 days after a new prime minister was sworn in and a new government was sworn in Israel. And the first question I would pose to you, gentlemen, is how do you think this newness on both sides would affect the relations between the two countries. I mean, everybody says, and I think rightly so, that the relations between Israel and the United States are rock solid, and that the United States is indeed Israel's greatest ally. And I believe that will be true and is true always. But at the same time, here we have two new administrations, totally new. Will the newness and the fact that they don't really know each other that well affect the relations between the president and the prime minister and between the two administrations? I don't know whether you, Zalman, or Tom want to be the first to answer that question.
I think we should.
I'd be glad to give way to Zalman.
Okay.
Tom, first of all, really, I'm very glad to see you. Are you still in deepest Virginia?
Yes, I am, Zalman.
Okay, well, Tom, of course, did a magnificent job all over the world, but especially here in Israel. And Tom, we continued our relationship in a restaurant which no longer exists in Washington, D.C. And I'm very happy now to be with you on screen. Look, to relate to the question of Danny, and Danny, thank you also. You spoke too highly of me, but it's okay, that's nice. My wife is listening, so I'm sure it's going to please her. Frankly, I think, and I'm not saying this in a derogative way, I think there's going to be more continuity than change. I think the tone will be different, and that's good, but the tune will be basically the same, except perhaps on a very important matter, on the matter of Iran, the nuclear threat from Iran, where the basic Israeli position is not going to change, but because we want to reduce, perhaps not eliminate, but certainly reduce any possibility of controversy with the United States, and I fully agree with what you said, Danny. America remains and will continue to remain our most important ally and our most important, I would say, factor of reference on anything. But otherwise, on matters of Palestinian issues and the so-called Abraham peace record or peace agreements, I think there will be a great deal of continuity. Of course, on the Palestinian issue, the Biden administration, in my assessment, has not yet made up its mind, because originally I think the Biden people wanted to reduce, or certainly not move forward proactively on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. But there are other voices also in the State Department and around the president who think differently. He also has to take into consideration the so-called squad in the House of Representatives, which is pushing the administration in a certain direction. But what the actual decision will be, I don't know. I think President Biden made a very important and very constructive statement about 10 days ago, or 2 weeks ago, when he said, there will only be peace when Israel's neighbors recognize the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. And that's what we have been saying all along. And it was important to hear this from the President of the United States. So I'll just conclude in saying again what Danny said. Our relationship with America is important, more than important. It's vital, I would say, from many points of view, not just the diplomatic, not just the security, many other factors as well. But it is difficult. And now I'm going back to, all politics is local, as Tip O'Neill said, whether the makeup of the new Israeli government will make it possible for Israel to really take any sort of position on any of these issues in order to avoid the government breaking up. And hopefully Israeli diplomacy will not be static, at least in the next few months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zalman.
Thank
Tom?
you, Salman, and perhaps I could add a few things. I agree with a great deal that you have said and think that we should begin with the fundamentals. The fundamentals of our relationship are solid and they remain abiding, and they are the lodestar by which we must move our policies, and they are critically important. We are committed to each other's security and defense. We are committed to honoring our joint commitment to democracy, and we are committed to our long-term goal of peace and security in the Middle East, and hope, and I believe will, in some ways, make progress in that direction. There are some torn fragments from the past which the new administrations on both sides will have to address. In each case, there are distractions that the new administrations will face in dealing with these torn fragments. One is, I think, the unfortunate decision of former Prime Minister Netanyahu to attach himself much more firmly to one political party over the other, when the root of our relationship has been, should be, and continues and ought to be bipartisan commitments on both sides. This will not change rapidly and will not be easy to recalibrate. And as Zalman, you quite astutely said, we do not know yet with which conditions of stability or instability the new government of Israel will govern. We hope it is stable. We hope it will have a long life. We hope that we can honor it and our relationship with great cooperation and with broader understanding, and that can, over a period of time, result in a new and more broad bipartisan consensus. We have seen the beginnings of some of this. They may not be totally, in my view, widely and warmly greeted by those on your side of the political divide, Zalman. But you and I have always discussed in the greatest frankness and in the deepest friendship whatever differences we have. And I say what I just said very much in that spirit. And I say that hopefully, as this new government proceeds, it can understand and recognize that in the United States, in the Democratic Party, there are also factions and there are also tendencies. Some of the more, quote, progressive, unquote, left, and some of the more conservative right. In both cases, one would hope that they would honor our fundamental commitment to Israel. But in both cases, I hope each would appear before the other in a spirit of frankness and friendship when we have different views on questions, particularly with respect to how and in what way the future of peace in the region should be organized and pursued. In that regard, there was clearly a change in the attitude of the Biden government with respect to the Gaza war and the view that it took with that regard with respect to Prime Minister Netanyahu, their encouragement of an early ceasefire and their encouragement of stability in the ceasefire, and the visit of the Secretary of State here on an open and friendly basis was, I think, in part a result of deep concern that without American attention and without American support for a more peaceful relationship in the region, it could and might get out of hand and become clearly much more devastatingly bad than it was. On the second question, and you have touched on that, Zalman, there have been and will continue to be, I think, differences over Iran. But there is absolutely no difference over the question that we both share a great feeling about, that Iran should not be allowed to become a nuclear power, and that we should do all that we can to stop that happening. There are differences over the tactics of doing that and perhaps the strategy. The Biden administration feels that returning to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is the best way to open the door to the future changes in that particular agreement to repair the area where we have differences over it can be made. And that without moving in that direction, we cannot get the better agreement that we seek down the road, both on the nuclear side, on the missile side, and with respect to Iran's treatment of its proxies in the region and its own failure to observe modern standards of human rights and civil discourse and so on. All the areas where we have differences, all the differences which we share fully with Israel, and hopefully we can, over this period of time, bring about a greater cohesion of support from Israel over that type of procedure, having experimented in the past 4 years with greater pressure, which has produced no result except the unhinging of Iran's commitments to the nuclear questions that are important to both of us. But I'm glad to discuss that if you like, and clearly it's something that we do need discussion. During the course of the long negotiations over the nuclear agreement, I made a number of visits to Israel and spoke extensively, along with my colleagues, to Israeli leadership and to Israeli expertise on this subject. I have to tell you, in all frankness, I found more sympathy with the direction in which Obama administration then, and now the Biden administration is heading, than I saw in the decision of Prime Minister Netanyahu and in the leadership of the country. I respect, obviously, their role and their responsibility for the policy of the country during their incumbency. But I was pleased to note that we had open dialogues, that we had differences that we could respect each other over, and that those differences were not so transcendental that they could lead to a major break between the United States and Israel. I've spoken a long time. I'm sorry for that. I open my mind to hear what you all have to say, and I'm prepared to continue our discussion in the spirit in which I think we always enjoyed, of frank conversation and significant efforts to find the compromises and indeed the coordination that we both need, particularly in one of the most perilous regions of the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. And I must say, both of you are making the life of a moderator very, very easy, because both in Zalman's and your remarks, you have mentioned the subjects which I wanted to touch upon, namely bipartisanship, attention to Israel and the Middle East, the special relationship, the Iran nuclear deal. And I would like maybe to touch upon two of them. I'm not sure how connected they are, but first of all, truly, I think one of Israel's greatest assets has always been the totally bipartisan support of the United States for Israel across the aisle, regardless of who was in the White House or in Congress or in the Senate. The support for Israel was always bipartisan. We have lost some of that bipartisanship over the last few years. And without laying blame anywhere, I think it is a fact of life. Because it is so important, what can both administrations do in order to restore this very special relationship to its bipartisanship? But I will maybe ask another question which ties into what you said about Gaza. You mentioned the word attention to Israel, attention to the Middle East. I always felt, prior to President Biden entering the Oval Office, that the menu that you will find on his table will include many, many different items, but that Israel and the Middle East, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, will be way down the line, maybe not even among the major desserts. Has this changed as a result of the Gaza conflict? Has the Gaza conflict, to some extent, been a wake-up call and drawn the United States back to being an active player and a major player in trying to solve this conflict? Or will the other issues, such as the pandemic, the economic situation, climate change, the economy, and many other issues which are on the president's table, precede them, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or two-state solution, or whatever we think the solution should be, will be back on the back burner?
And let me comment on that, because it's a critically important question, and you asked it in an open and I think frank and significant way. Let me say this. I think the Biden administration, when it came in, adopted something every American administration is preeminently saddled with, that domestic policy questions trump foreign policy. And I don't mean to use that word in any political significance other than its direct and clear meaning. And in that regard, that was very much how the Biden administration approached things. And the three issues at the top of their list were clearly the pandemic, the resulting economic destruction in the United States, at least on a significant, hopefully temporary basis, and indeed the revelation that the United States had not solved in any serious way the problem of racism, which has plagued our country for a long period of time. And I'm not someone who spends his time thinking about why the United States has made mistakes and how and in what way the U.S. ought to spend its entire period atoning for those and correcting them. But I do think that each of these particularly important issues still plays a dominant role in how this administration reviews foreign policy questions. On foreign policy questions themselves, at the top of the list, China and Russia, where we are hearing the press conference right now of the two leaders after their summit today, play an important role, as well as the rebuilding of U.S. allied support, particularly in Europe. And it was seen then that the Middle East, which 20 years ago used to be characterized by problems in three I-word country areas, in Iran, Iraq, and in Israel and its neighborhood, has now reached a crescendo of conflict and problems and tensions that have extended well beyond that. And that has made the problem of Israel and its neighbors and peace with its neighbors and peace particularly with the Palestinians of much less moment in the view of the United States, and presidents looking to deprioritize foreign policy issues have found it convenient in the main to say this is going nowhere, it will get nowhere, that there are deep problems on both sides of this issue, both with respect to the leadership and the outlook, and people are farther away than they have ever been from any meeting of the minds on this question, and therefore we can let it languish. And several American presidents have adopted that view of both parties. And this administration came in very much suffused with that view. It was indeed, Dan, and your observation is correct, that the Gaza conflict changed that view. It changed that view, at least for the time. The question I have in mind, and I cannot answer for you, is whether that change has any permanent status or whether over a period of time, with less disturbance and more tranquility, that question will dwindle off into fourth and fifth rank again, or whether people will pay more attention to it now. My sense is that a combination of factors are, in all frankness, driving it back in to the undealt with, unmet with, unattended to kind of question, which in 4 or 5 months we will see once again not being dealt with at all, and that the composition of the new Israeli government does not lead me to have high confidence that there will be any changes there, nor does the stasis in which the leadership divide, so deeply seen among Palestinians, and their inability to address the future on any kind of a united basis will lead us to believe that there is an opportunity there. And of course, the failure to appoint some kind of renowned leader in the United States to deal with this problem is yet another indication of the fact that we are once again on the path to inattention rather than to the path of attention. And I do not normally speak this way. I normally consider myself an optimist, but after these years and after the recent passage of events, it is hard for me to change that conclusion.
Well, thank you, Tom. You know, Shimon Peres used to say that optimists and pessimists end up the same way. So it's far better to live as an optimist. And Zalman, I would love to hear your thoughts, both on the bipartisanship and Gaza, and the attention of the United States to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I wanted to say there's another definition of optimism. An optimist is a person who doesn't know all the facts. But let's be more optimistic about optimism. I agree to many things which Tom said, not necessarily from the same angle, but as realists, diplomats or ex-diplomats. I think that the way he analyzes the situation, both here in Israel and in the United States, is factual. And I sometimes wonder, and just going now to the side a little bit, there are articles, especially in the American press, for instance, there's this article by Russell Mead says, America is no longer relevant in the Middle East. First of all, I think that's wrong, but it's certainly wrong with regards to Israel, as I said before. With regards to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, yes, because the Netanyahu administration, and this was not something which occurred, let's say, overnight or all of a sudden an idea coming or something like that, because this has been Netanyahu's strategy, I would say, from the day he became prime minister, from the very first day, that instead of seeing the Israeli-Palestinian issue as the only cause of instability in the Middle East and so on and so forth, as the late Mr. Brzezinski used to repeat every day, no, we should go around, try to establish peaceful relations with major parts of the Arab world, not to neglect the Palestinian issue, but to form a different climate of opinion, a climate of feeling in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, in the Muslim Middle East, which will be more conducive to eventually establishing peace between, or let's say, an arrangement at least, between Israel and the Palestinians, because real peace may still be far away. With regards to the Gaza issue, I agree with the analysis of Tom, and I don't know what the conclusion will be, as he doesn't. Will the Palestinian issue, be back more or less on the back burner, or on the contrary, perhaps, there'll be another attempt to try to actively promote some sort of negotiations and so on and so forth, I think it would be very negative from America's point of view if one would just repeat what has already failed in the past, and obviously have failed, whoever is to fault for that. Certainly not only Israel, because there were different Israeli negotiations or different Israeli administrations in this matter. There is still the refusal of the Palestinian organized national movement to recognize the right of the Jewish people to a state. And that is very important in the Middle East. It's not just a sort of diplomatic disagreement, it's an ideological disagreement. And with regard specifically to the Gaza issue, Tom, I think that the possibility of a two-state formula solution at the present time, and I'm stressing the present time, is more or less off the table. Because most Israelis of whichever political view or view say to themselves, what happened from Gaza will happen tomorrow from the West Bank, which is much closer to the center of Israel. The West Bank will go Hamas. There was a poll, by the way, just published today. More than 70% of Palestinians in the West Bank support Hamas. So Israelis will say to themselves, is the situation as it is now, with all its deficiencies and drawbacks, the so-called status quo, which the American diplomacy usually said it's unsustainable, but has been sustained for over 50 years. Isn't that, for the present, the best formula, call it status quo or whatever, not the final, necessarily the final resolution, because I'm talking now in my own view. In my view, this is also Netanyahu's view. We are certainly against a state where the Jewish attitude or the Jewish factor and the democratic factor would vanish. I think most Israelis understand that. And I don't think that the Greater Israel movement represents today anything of a majority view. But having this sort of dilemma between a Palestinian state ruled and controlled by Hamas with the support of Iran, as we saw the support of Iran in Gaza as well, with the support of Iran and Iran's designs on Israel and for the Middle East in general, people will say, we'd rather wait. When it comes to a different point, like President Biden said, when our neighbors will recognize our right to exist as a Jewish state, well, I think most Israelis will say, let's separate. But this is not the moment.
Thank you, Zalman. Let me ask you a question which I must admit I've grappled with many times. And the question really is, and taking into account that we have a new president in the White House and a new prime minister in Jerusalem, how important are personal relations? People tend to say, listen, diplomacy, international relations are not a love affair. It's a matter of interests. It's a matter of joint demands or joint interests. And personal relations don't matter. I personally happen to believe very much in personal relationships. And I think we have examples in history where personal relations did matter. Like, for example, the very unsavory relations between FDR and Churchill. Now that we have two new men, one not so new to politics, but new to the White House, and a younger person in Israel, how, and knowing that the personal relations over the last 4 years between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump were very, very warm, as opposed to the personal relations with President Obama in the 8 previous years, how important. It leads also to a question of the role of ambassadors. because we are sometimes the go-betweens and the people who try to mend things. But at the end of the day, decisions are made by leaders. How important are personal relations in today's world?
Whom do you ask?
I'm asking both of you. I don't know. I see Tom thinking, so maybe you can go first, Zalman.
Well, okay. Look, I think personal relationships in anything, but including in diplomacy or relations between countries, are important. We saw, for instance, you mentioned one thing, but we could mention Golda Meir and President Johnson, for instance. The personal relationships do count, but let's not exaggerate. By the way, Biden and Bibi were good friends. I think at the end of the day, the personal relationship has an influence on procedures, on decisions, but basically it comes down to the strategic, geopolitical, political interests of both countries or of either country. So the job of an ambassador, and I'll cite Tom now, and I'm not talking about myself, is even if there are disagreements, and there obviously always have been from day one, and there will be, like on Iran, the job of the ambassador is to smooth those corners as much as possible. Or as Moshe Dayan used to say, look, let's go to fight only on the really vital issues. On all the rest, let's debate, let's discuss.
Thank you, Zalman.
I agree with Zalman very much on this point. I hope you can hear me. And
Yes,
that personal relationships are a centerpiece of diplomacy. But personal relationships do not change deeply held feelings about national interest. But what they do is to make it possible for two leaders to explore the range of possible compromises in a more open-minded way than they might as if personal animosities dominated the relationship. Personal animosities add emotional antipathy. They add suspicion and lack of trust. And good personal relationships are the opposite. They build trust. They build a set of confidences. They are supported by not telling untruths and by keeping your word as an envoy, diplomat, or representative of your country, and always making sure that if in fact a mistake has been made, it gets recognized and corrected as soon as possible rather than allowed to fester and color negatively relationship between the people dealing with the issue. And these are very important. Tom Nides will be a superb ambassador to Israel. He is frank, he is correct, he is open, but he comes with empathy and with sympathy and with open-mindedness about your country. And he will listen. And listening is one of those hallmarks of personal relationship that are often forgotten. And indeed, this program is based on an antipathy to listening among those of us who have the word here. But you will forgive us for that one mistake we make in the interest, hopefully, of using our capacity to speak to build a relationship of confidence and friendship rather than just our capacity to listen, which in a face-to-face personal relationship is something that always takes place and that is very important. And indeed, Zoom has not found the way to replace constructive listening and indeed body language in response to listening that can convey things without having to use your voice to dominate the conversation. And these are all things that you learn as a diplomat, that you learn as a human being. And diplomacy is no different than a good marriage, and in many ways bears many of the hallmarks of that kind of a relationship, and is seen in the notion that you must begin with respect, even if you lack it in terms of the lead up to the first meeting, if I could put it that way. And there was something in the summit today that I saw that I think plays a role in hopefully improving relations between the United States and Russia, a country I also know something about. And that is the capacity to listen, to convey respect, to be totally frank, and to be fully honest. And all of those don't necessarily fit in the same formula. They have to be mixed and matched in ways that are clearly very much a product of experience, maturity, and knowledge.
Thank you, Tom. Touching upon a question which we have already discussed, but from a different viewpoint. You did mention, Tom, I remember, I think in your first remarks, that you described it, I think no strong leader has really been appointed to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Probably thinking of someone like George Mitchell in Northern Ireland, or Richard Holbrooke in Bosnia and Afghanistan. The question is, would you and Zalman, as seasoned and great diplomats, recommend that if indeed the United States wants to play a role and try to reach a resolution together with, and I agree with Zalman, not just Israeli-Palestinian, but the regional resolution, which we've started very well with the Abraham Accords, would you recommend that this be a public effort or a back channel, secret, behind-the-scenes effort? I'll just take the liberty of quoting Shimon Peres. You mentioned marriage. Shimon Peres said that there are two things one should not do in public: make love and make peace. In both cases, it's a good idea to have the light slightly dimmed and the eyes slightly shut. Would you agree with that?
I think that it is very important in something like this to use every opportunity to build the relationship of confidence that we're talking about, and that those who come publicized in advance for the great achievements they are going to make bear an extra burden of responsibility that they shouldn't be loaded with until they have had a time quietly to explore with the other side the issues, to come to a broader understanding of how and in what way there may be a strategy of working through those issues, and that publicity and public, put it this way, puffery of the envoys is a mistake in disadvantage for doing what they should be doing quietly and carefully at first, is building a constituency for themselves with the other side that can use their private conversations to explore and build knowledge, and use that as the basis for moving ahead, rather than the fact that this particular individual come advertised as the champion of champions, and he will go and mow down the other side one way or another by his public acclaim.
Thank you, Tom. Zalman, you are a veteran of many negotiations. You were in the Madrid conference, you were in the Camp David agreements, you were in the Y plantation agreements, you took part in the agreements or the talks that led to the Israeli-Egyptian peace, and I think to a certain extent also the Israeli-Jordanian peace. So you're a real veteran of negotiations, both secret and public. What would your recommendation be?
First of all, a word of correction. I was not in the Camp David talks at the time. I was sent to Washington, actually. I was sitting in the embassy trying to do the necessary PR, whatever the results would be from these negotiations, because we were quite worried at the time. I was with Moshe Dayan, as you remember, that the conference would fail and that Israel would be blamed, by Carter especially. So we had what we would call a public diplomacy sort of job. But the other things you said are correct, completely correct. I would say I'm a champion and an adherent of silent diplomacy. If you call it back channel or whatever, I think this is especially important in the Middle East, where each of the leaders has to face very difficult public opinion in his own constituency, not only in Israel, but certainly amongst the Palestinians. Therefore, during the Washington talks after the Madrid conference, we had this sort of back-channel communications with the Jordanians and even with the leader of the Palestinian group, who was very anti-Arafat, by the way, a man from Gaza. And we could exchange views in a much more constructive way, but never outwardly, never publicly. Therefore, I think that if those back-channel procedures or proceedings are going forward to a certain point, then it comes to the point where leaders, official personalities must step into the breach and say, that's it, that's what we want to do. And that happened with Jordan. And of course, recently it happened very much so with the leadership of the Emirates, that at a certain point, for all the different reasons involved, America and so on and so forth, the leadership of these countries could step forward and say, yes, that is what our interest is. And that wouldn't have happened also without, of course, preliminary back-channel proceedings. So I would say it's a combination of the two, but certainly start with the back channels before you go public with anything.
Right, thank you, Zalman. I think we have a few minutes left, and I would like to bring you some questions which I received from the audience. Probably because of your wisdom and expertise, both of you, most of the questions are about subjects which you've already touched upon. So I will not repeat them. But there is a question here about, from Howard Brown, saying the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan have all signed, I don't think it's true about Morocco, have all signed the Abraham Accords and established normalization and relations trade with Israel during the recent violence with Hamas. Not one of these countries pulled out, during the recent violence, not one of these countries pulled out of the agreements. Can this pattern be replicated with other countries?
I would like to say perhaps here that there ought to be hope that that is the case, that it is important that Israel have good relationships with the widest variety of countries in the region, particularly including the Arab countries, and that the efforts that were made to bring that about were important. I am not happy with the notion that those efforts at one point in time seem to be taken to the disadvantage of the Palestinians. And one had tendencies to look at if you had good relations with the UAE, you didn't have to pay attention to the Palestinian side. But that's a smaller and I think less significant part of what we have seen in the building of these better relationships. Now, it is true, some of those relationships preceded in the quiet channel, if I could put it that way. In the back channel, the actual opening up in a public sense of the relationships now known as the Abrahamic Accords. And indeed, we have seen quiet back channel relationships in countries which have not yet publicly opened up the flowering of their relationship with Israel, like Saudi Arabia, which we hope will take place. But I would hope that rather than detract from the notion that it is important that Israel enjoy as soon as possible in this region the kind of untrammeled peace which Israel deserves and which obviously the other countries in the region deserve, that somehow these relationships be put together in a way that makes that even more possible and that brings to the attention of the Biden administration the necessity that in one way or another, the United States, as a firm friend of both sides, play a more important role in bringing about something here which can result in the permanent peace that we all should be seeking here as a matter of urgency and importance, despite the enormous obstacles that have been in the way and obstacles which I presented previously and criticized because I thought they were standing in the way of how to proceed. And I'm not here advocating one state, two states, or three states. I think that has to evolve from a relationship. But I do think that it is time that each side here, Israel and the Palestinians, move themselves in the direction of opening up more productive private channels of conduct that can in one way or another seek to take on the differences between them. And that waiting for the eventual unity of the Palestinians, or indeed the selection by Israel of a preferred alternative itself in respect of peace with the Palestinians, should be supplemented now. The kind of conversations we have been talking about, and as a result of the very important questions you have asked us, Dan, about diplomacy and diplomacy in the region.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think this may be the last question from the audience. Before I ask Alan, who opened this session so graciously, to close it. And that is, I think this question came from Wendy Revel, and it's saying, do you think that the Qatari money is helping building up Hamas and their confidence for aggressive behavior, or giving leverage on them to moderate their behavior? And I would add to that, do you see a chance, in view of recent developments, of a Marshall Plan for Gaza?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking both of you, yes.
Okay. Look, there was a report in today's press in Israel that the Israeli security establishment has come to the conclusion that at least part of the Qatari money, not because of anybody's intention or will on the Israeli side, or perhaps even on the Qatari side, I don't know, did go into the coffers of Hamas and built up the Hamas capabilities of war and terrorism against Israel. And I think they put the blame mainly on the technical procedures more than on actual intentions in Qatar or anywhere else. But that's a fact. But if you look at the Gaza issue, which, by the way, during the Netanyahu government, we avoided wars. There was lots of trouble, but we avoided major wars, although there were voices in Netanyahu's government and in the present new government who wanted an all-out military campaign against Hamas in Gaza, and I don't know how this is going to act or play in the future. The issue, of course, is Israel could eliminate physically, militarily, Hamas in Gaza. It could do it without any doubt. But what's happening after that? Are we going to rule and manage the Gaza Strip? This is something all of us should beware of, and I would say distance ourselves as much as possible. Therefore, being realistic, I'm afraid that the situation with regards to Gaza will be more of the same for quite a long time. Perhaps one day, if there will be a real settlement of the Palestinian issue, which I don't see also happening tomorrow morning or even in the day after that, there could be a solution in spite of the fact that, of course, there are such severe political differences between the rulers of Gaza and the so-called rulers of the West Bank, that even with the best of will of Israel and the United States, and even the Arab countries around that, the issue may not be settled. So we may be in for a long wait, and a serious one.
Thank you.
Let me
Zalman.
say, Dan, in my response to that question, I agree very much with Zalman. I think the money goes to both objectives, unfortunately, and we have not developed a useful way to separate the humanitarian objective to help Gazans who badly need the help from the military objectives to help Hamas in one way or another, either build tunnels or acquire armaments or rearm themselves for some future military engagement, or buy or acquire rockets and so on, all of which obviously we deplore and which shouldn't happen. On the other hand, I am very much convinced that in one way or another, as I said a moment ago, beginning to talk quietly with your enemy, and it was Yitzhak Rabin who famously said that's where you have to make peace, is the beginning of the unfolding of enough understanding to hopefully set the groundwork that permanent Israeli occupation of large numbers of Palestinians is not, in my view, a suitable alternative, despite the fact that Zalman may believe, and he may be right, that it is the least worst alternative for the present situation. But the least worst alternative has shown endlessly its capacity to produce larger and more significant and more damaging conflict. And if that is indeed the case, then we need to be concerned about it. I think finally, the United States has proved magnificently with 220 years war that military solutions to diplomatic problems are not a very good way of proceeding, if I can say with massive understatement of the week, and that it takes a significant amount of diplomacy, maybe backed up by military strength and indeed by military capacity. But military force and victory parades have never solved a problem that is political in nature with the greatest respect, and that it has been even at the end of the Second World War. A sensible occupation of Germany and Japan and real change in democratic life in those countries under occupation that has made the difference. And I think that we need to begin to think about those hard lessons in diplomacy, and hopefully they can provide some edification for us in how and in what way to deal with your part of the world.
Thank you, Tom. Well, this went much faster and quicker. I've never known an hour to pass so quickly, but we are unfortunately at the end of our time. I would like to thank you both for sharing your experience, your wisdom, your diplomatic, truly diplomatic excellence, and your friendship with us. I think everybody will have benefited very, very much from your insights. And I thank you for taking the time for being with us, both Ambassador Pickering and Ambassador Cheval, Tom and Zalman. Thank you. And I would now like to pass the
And thank you
baton
for a wonderful job.
Well, thank you. Coming from
Thank
you,
you,
it's the
Dan, for
ultimate
a
compliment.
privilege and an honor to be on your program, and thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Tom. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm sure everyone will agree with me that we would have benefited from several more hours of discussion by our panelists. I would also like to thank Ambassador Zalman Choval, Tom Pickering, and our moderator, Dan Gilliman, for taking the time to share their knowledge and insights with us on some of the many issues that are burning and have significant impact on our daily lives and our worldview. Thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us today, and we hope to see you next Sunday, which is Father's Day here in the United States, at noon for another great program featuring an intimate conversation with my fellow board member, the Honorable Robert Bob Abrams, former Attorney General of the state of New York, on his recently released book, The Luckiest Guy in the World. We look forward to seeing you then.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, and have a great Father's Day.
Hopefully we'll see you. Bye.